Yep, we are now live, and I think we are ready to go. Thank you to the audiences for those who managed to join this session. I'm truly excited. I'm honored to be your host and your chair for this session on the development and piloting of responsive evidence systems for policy needs, insights from South Africa and Cameroon. So I think we really have an exciting panel who are basically going to provide insights from South Africa and Cameroon on the development and piloting of responsive evidence systems for policy needs. And we'll hear from the speakers as they share the reflections on how they've advanced rapid response evidence synthesis in their respective government contexts, and also what capacity sharing elements supported this process. And without wasting any more time, let me just have a quick intro of the panel. The panelist is basically, this is 3 presentations with 4 panelists, and to just briefly introduce them, we have Dr. Laurenz Mahlanza-Langer from the South Africa Center for Evidence, is the director of the center. It's based in Johannesburg. We also have in the panel Zeenat Ishmail, who is the Provincial Data Officer at the Department, at the Western Cape Government, Department of the Premier. And we also have Mufika Sali, who is the director also from the Department of Premier in Western Cape, in South Africa. And we also have Dr. Patrick Okwen from Effective Basic Services, eBASE. He's the team lead there, and also a medical officer at the Bali District Health Services in Cameroon. And I'm happy to share with you and would invite you all to extend a big congratulations to Dr. Patrick Okwen, who has recently been awarded the Campbell's Robert Boruch Award to honor his contributions to promoting evidence to inform policy and in practice. So a big congratulations to you, Dr. Patrick Okwen. And yeah, so that's basically it. Let's just jump in. And our first presenter will be Dr. Laurenz Mahlanza-Langer, sorry. And yeah, Dr. Laurenz, over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Promise. I'm just double checking my audio is still okay and my slides still showing okay?
100%.
Super, brilliant. So I have a very small and nice role to introduce the idea of responsive evidence systems. And then you'll hear a little bit more about our colleagues from the PDO and eBASE, what's the actual work. So I'm Laurenz, and I work for SACE, and SACE is kind of the coordinating organization for this particular project. Apologies, I have a bit of a feedback here. So very quickly, who and why is SACE? We're an NPC who's trying to get evidence into use, but we're not trying to get evidence into use for decision making just for fun. We're trying to get evidence into use to do something about the many social issues in our context. And in South Africa, that is particularly poverty and inequality. And so for us, using evidence is really not necessarily a big technical endeavor where we discuss methods, the advantages of systematic reviews versus randomized control trials. For us, using evidence is really an ethical imperative. It's like, how can we ensure that data and evidence is used by our decision makers so that we have effective policies and that support poverty reduction and reduction of inequality? And, of course, we know evidence is not the silver bullet. So evidence in its own right will not get poverty eradicated, but it does has a role to play. And the more evidence we have in our policies, the higher the chance is that maybe these policies do have an impact. And so that's really our starting point, and that's kind of why we get up in the morning, and that's what gets us excited about our work and where we try to make a difference. So how does it link to this particular project? So we started thinking a little bit, there's a lot of different actors in this field of evidence-informed decision-making. And kind of we all work in our silos and we collaborate here and there, but it's really hard to see how we're coming together. So we started to think a little bit, how would a responsive evidence system for African policy needs, or in short, REAP, how would that look like? And what if we could collaborate together and connect the different actors to make sure that the use of evidence is a routine process? And in particular, how does coordination and engagement in such a space work? So if we have a group of dedicated individuals and organizations who already in their local settings have tailored evidence available, how do we connect those actors so that we have ideally an institutionalized responsive evidence systems across context, and that maybe can then amplify the individual initiatives and lead to a more connected system? So that's really kind of where we started thinking, where our starting point came from. So how do we scale up, and how do we connect these different evidence units that support the use of evidence for poverty eradication? So, and the specific context, just to give you the quick background, there was really that this started happening during COVID-19. So I think lots of different teams working to support the use of evidence, we were under massive demand by decision makers, and really rapid demand. So when COVID started happening, suddenly everybody wanted evidence. And yes, most of us had worked in this space for a long time, but the demand was really a tsunami that we'd never seen before. And also the demand for different capacities. So teams were asked to respond rapidly, and just the mere assignments were too much, but then also the type of the assignments started to differ, and it was really difficult to respond. And we all had to work across different sectors for the first time. So for example, we hadn't worked in health before. We had to suddenly work on the use of evidence in the health sector, and we had to cross boundaries, we had to cross systems, and yeah, it got really, really a little bit tricky to keep up with that tsunami. And of course, and that's why you have this little picture there, all of that happened in a virtual space. So we weren't even together, we were all sitting on our different corners. And that really got us thinking, well, how do we manage a support system for these different evidence units who all of us are sitting in our own corners, and how can we support each other a bit more systemically, and that we have connections, that we maybe are a bit better prepared for the next tsunami of evidence that might come. So that's where we are at the moment. So we start about the support system, and well, let's test this idea in the first phase. And in the first phase of REAP, it's really three things that we're trying to test out. So the first one is to develop an online platform that can assist the conduct of responsive evidence services. And then the second one is to have a pedagogy that can support this online platform, to think a little bit more about what are the capacities needed to support the use of evidence. And so if we have this model for online capacity building for EIDM, as well as a platform that can support such services, maybe we have two building blocks that make the routine use of evidence and the support of capacity in that area a bit more systemic. And then the third area was to try out this type of system with 5 evidence units. And I think this is really the exciting part today, where we have 2 of these units present, and we'll talk a little bit about this experience from the PDO and from eBASE. So maybe very quickly to frame, like if we hear us talk about responsive evidence services, what does that mean in our world? And it's really a bucket of services. So from a technical perspective, a suite of on-demand activities that can include quite a few things, from rapid syntheses, the more traditional rapid reviews, to embedded science advice, to co-production, rapid evaluation, and so forth. So it's a really, really large bucket of services of getting evidence into use in a responsive manner. And maybe to make this a little bit more practical, to give you an idea, Promise actually a couple of years ago led a rapid evidence map on land reform in South Africa, an evidence map using 3 methodologies produced within 3 weeks, that then informed a report that went to the president of the country. So that would be something that fits the definition of arrest. But maybe a more different example is that colleagues of ours are also sitting on the Ministerial Advisory Committee on mental health, and they're being asked on a kind of a bi-weekly basis to provide evidence and then have an evidence surveillance system in place. And again, that would count as a RES. Or sometimes we have colleagues who are reporting to Parliament and they're being asked questions in Parliament, and they need evidence like within the next hour to back up the question that's being posed to them. and then there's a rapid look for the evidence. And again, that would fit the definition of a RES. So I hope that gives a bit of a practical feel. But kind of the common themes in there. So the RES is triggered by a question or evidence need of a decision maker, and that it's an urgent evidence needs, and it can't be answered in isolation or with a quick Google search. So just maybe then on a technical level, why do we think that's important? Or why is RES in the toolbox of evidence-informed decision-making tools important? So I think we'd see particular three barriers where RES can play an important contribution. And the first one is around not having the right evidence available at the point of decision making. So we know that oftentimes in decision making context, the evidence arrives too late or it just takes too long to produce it. Oftentimes we don't find enough evidence, and then we tell decision makers as researchers, well, just fund more research or fund more data, which doesn't really help the specific decision making need in that moment. Oftentimes our evidence lacks legitimacy and relevance to the context of decision making, or we outright address questions that are maybe not of the highest priority to decision makers themselves. So RES hopefully can do something about this lack of timely and relevant evidence at the point of decision making. However, at the same time, even when we might have that evidence available in a specific instant, there's certainly a lack of critical mass of capacity to conduct RES in an ongoing manner, particularly across a national system of evidence. And I think there might be, in our understanding, three issues, particularly with the EIPM capacity here. The first one is it's often too technical and rigid, so that the methods expertise for certain evidence universities and not necessarily within the decision-making organizations. Oftentimes, expertise is organized in methods or sectoral silos. So somebody from education doesn't necessarily want to provide a RES in the health sector. Or oftentimes, the capacity might be there, but it's not accessible rapidly enough. So what happens if a government decision maker needs a response within a day? There's no time to go through a contracting procurement process. So that's kind of the second issue around like being held back by a lack of the capacity on conducting RES. And then the third one, a third barrier, which might be the solution to this, to the first two, is actually the lack of collaboration. So that the actors that might have these capacities to provide RES or to help other people to provide RES are not well connected enough. And by not being well connected enough, not collaborating enough, and therefore we're missing out on the benefits of collaboration, which would be to have a trusted system of familiar actors that quickly can collaborate, jump onto new assignments, a lack of pathways for evidence access that are institutionalized and set out in advance that can be followed in a rapid situation. So we've played around with quite a few methods, and I won't speak much to this because our colleagues from the PDO and eBASE will tell us some of these in practice. But yeah, so under responsive evidence methods, we can talk about synthesis, we can talk about knowledge brokering, we can talk about different ways of sharing capacities, and we keep adding more. So in particular, the storytelling aspect from Patrick is really exciting. One thing I wanted to mention, though, is that the principle of co-production and partnership working is key within any of these responsive evidence methods. So we do believe that only through co-production and co-creation do evidence methods gain the relevance that they need in the decision-making context. And then my very last slide that I just wanted to mention, so within this broader body of responsive evidence services, we think quite a bit about how do we measure whether this initiative actually does make an impact. And that comes from a frustration for our own work that oftentimes we're not sure what of our interventions to support evidence use are actually in themselves evidence informed. So do we have a standardized indicator for evidence use? How do we measure evidence use? How do we measure interventions that are supporting the use of evidence? So that's something we think about quite a bit within REAP, and yeah, it's a slightly different area of work, but I think it's important to keep in mind as you listen to the presentation of the other colleagues. So I hope that has given a little bit of an overview of what we're doing in this space, and now I'll hand over to Patrick to give us his insights from Cameroon. Thank you.
Okay, let me share my slides.
So as you share your slides, just to say to Dr. Langer, thank you so much for those insights. So thank you so much for sharing with us the need for rapid evidence, for response evidence systems, highlighting the barriers and how we can overcome this. So we're really looking forward to hearing more from Dr. Okwen on the experiences in Cameroon. And over to you, Dr. Okwen.
Okay, thank you. My screen now. That's with technology.
Yeah, we can see your slides. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, so thank you very much, Promise, and thank you, Laurenz, for setting the pace. I'll be talking about the development and piloting of the response evidence systems for policy needs, with the insights from Cameroon in particular, and generally our plans to expand this to other French-speaking countries in Africa. So my slides will be in this format. I'll look at the background a little bit, the partnerships, the needs assessment, our stakeholder engagement sessions, our policy events, and our flagship storytelling or evidence-based storytelling. And then I'll dwell a little bit on our exchange visits that we plan to make to South Africa with government members and members of our team. So generally, evidence use in policy in Africa is limited. We actually don't have any concrete statistics, and I'm focusing mostly on Middle Africa. There's a lot of work that's been done in South Africa and in East Africa, and then significant or some work in western parts of Africa. But the Central Africa and especially the French-speaking countries actually still are in a very dark corridor. And one of our objectives joining the partnerships with the South Africa Center for Evidence and the Western Cape government was to facilitate or to improve this situation in the French-speaking African countries. Evidence literacy is generally low, and we will see in subsequent slides that this affects the uptake of research evidence, because if people do not know what evidence is or do not understand research evidence, they may not be able to use this. They may not even be able to move or want to use it, because you would only want to take up something that you know. Then capacity for evidence synthesis is growing. I think with work that was originally done by the Cochrane collaboration, through especially the South African Cochrane Center and the the African Cochrane Network, a lot of training or capacity building has been done, which facilitated or created some people or a good batch of people who can actually synthesize evidence. And also work that has been done by JBI is also facilitating knowledge translation within the African context. So this, all of this means that we have the recipe ready to move forward. It's all about now looking at approaches which can enable us really move on with what we want to do. And as Laurenz had already mentioned, part of it is the collaborations or the partnerships. And in this particular partnership, the REAP partnership, we are engaging three African governments, and that's the government of Cameroon, the government of Chad, the government of Niger, starting first for this year with the government of Cameroon within this partnership. And within the partnership, we also have the government of Western Cape, eBASE, and the South Africa Center for Evidence, each one bringing in a particular contribution to the partnership. So these partnerships or collaborations are very useful because it provides opportunities for everyone to benefit from. For example, we are sharing experiences, especially around our storytelling approach, our policy events, which we developed from other grants. We are also sharing capacity. The South Africa Center for Evidence is actually supporting eBASE in building capacity, including providing opportunities for PhDs for our research fellows at the University of Johannesburg. It also facilitates access to funds, because to roll out this REAP project, this funding is actually funding gotten by the South Africa Center for Evidence, which we would have otherwise not been able to use to develop the innovations that we are bringing on board to this REAP project. It's also an opportunity for learning. There's a lot of knowledge generation that is planned within this project. And to start, we already are learning a lot about the needs of policymakers in the Middle African region for evidence for decision making. It's also an opportunity for us to test our innovations. Our plan is that getting a PhD fellow on a program will be able to evaluate the impact of the storytelling approach, which we have now piloted from funding that we had from the French Embassy in Cameroon and the Grand Challenges Canada. So now the next step is looking at how can we scale this out? How can we test it in an RCT? How can we understand the details of behavior change and implementation science within this concept? And also very important, the cultural exchanges. We do have an opportunity to travel to South Africa and experience how work goes on there, experience the culture of South Africa. And the team in South Africa, the government, and the team at eBASE will also be visiting Cameroon. And these are wonderful opportunities for us to explore new cultures. Now, what strategies do we have? And these strategies, I must also highlight that the beauty of the REAP project is that built on each partner brings on board what they believe can contribute to move the project forward. And eBASE also has a strategy that's built within the main strategy of REAP, which Laurenz has so well elaborated. So we are starting our own with a needs assessment because the Middle African region is starting the race a little bit late. So needs assessment for South Africa, for example, is probably already well documented and published, but the needs assessment for this region is still lacking. So what we are actually currently doing is conducting a needs assessment. Thereafter, we'll build on experiences from the South African region, including the pedagogy clinics, experiences from our past projects, like the policy events that was funded by the CEDIL project, and then storytelling, which is our flagship project that we developed at eBASE. Our focus will be Francophone Africa. And for this year, we are starting with Cameroon. And for next year, we're going to expand to Chad and Niger. And our hope is that we could roll this out after this stage to further other African countries. Now, our needs assessment seeks to understand the policy needs for evidence-informed decision-making, because this is what is most important if you want that the policymakers should be in the driver's seat. Our objective is to have the policymakers in the driver's seat so that the policymakers could give us a call and tell us that we want to know if what are the best interventions we should roll out to combat poverty or to increase access to vaccinations or to increase access to essential medicines. So these are the kind of things that we want to see done by the policymakers. And so we have to understand what are their capacity needs. Do they understand the importance of evidence? Do they understand what is good quality research? What research is available at their level? What are the technology needs? Are they able to use the technologies that we use? Will they be able to access evidence portals? Are we going to be need to help hold their hand into these portals? Are we going to need to do paper portals for them? And there are also financial needs, and financial needs are pretty tricky. For us to get the policymakers to invest in these, we will need to, first of all, be able to invest in building their capacity and improving their literacy in evidence. So our next strategy is the stakeholder engagement. And this is something which is already well documented about engaging stakeholders. And we have used this quite a lot in all our projects at eBASE. So we brought this on board the REAP project. And on this diagram, you can actually see our mapping and analysis of stakeholders that are needed in this process. And if you see from this part, I'll just get the pointer. From this part, you see that this is the power. This axis is for power, and this axis is for interest. So there are people who have a high power to influence evidence use in in policy making, but they may not also have the interest. And I would have to highlight that power comes from those who are in decision-making positions, who can pass laws and policies or invest in doing something. Power can also come because someone does not have enough knowledge about something, so they don't have power, they don't have interest. So if we look at this axis here, this is where we want to get everybody. And interestingly, after assessing our stakeholders, we find out that the ministries actually have a high interest and high power. So those are the people that we are looking at working with. The other people who can also influence include the parliamentarians, the development agencies, and I particularly look at La Francophonie and Agence Française de Développement, and then the regional assemblies who have high power, but their interest is still limited, meaning that we need to do a lot of sensitization to catch their attention for this. We also have civil society organizations who are also in this area. And then below here, we have those who have high interest, but they actually don't have powers, like the knowledge brokers. And this includes organizations like eBASE. So our idea is that we do have the interest, but we need the power, and the power comes from funding and then our partnerships, especially with governments. And this is what we are trying to establish so that this can move us to this other quadrant. We also have community members, we have journalists and vulnerable groups. We also identified people who don't have power and don't have interest. And these are some decentralized arms of the government, including like divisional officers, subdivisional officers, and mayors at councils. So these are this is our understanding of the stakeholders. We also do stakeholder sessions to try to facilitate movement of people to the right or stakeholders to the right quadrant. Now, the pedagogy clinics is the approach that we intend to use to push through or to build capacity in policymakers. And this comes with opportunities for us to interact with policymakers, responding to evidence-informed decision making, and evaluating and then following up. Then we have our policy events. Our policy events are quite interesting because our policy events is one of the innovations that we've developed at eBASE, and it usually starts with presentation of scientific evidence, uh, uh, scientific results, and plain language summaries to the ministers themselves, their technical advisors, the directors, and then the CELCOM. And then after that, the ministers can go because they have a very busy schedule. And then we can now begin to evaluate or to evaluate the existing policies to identify the evidence gaps with technical advisors and the CELCOM. And then we will now go into a work session to integrate evidence in policy. And then we now develop our communication strategies. Our storytelling event is our flagship product, and this was initially funded by the Ambassade de France au Cameroon for us to develop the concept. Then this was further funded by the Grand Challenges Canada and the REC Maps or the e-COVID recommendations project for us to develop the pilot. So we are currently at the pilot, and we are looking forward to moving on to an impact evaluation with funding from different partners, and we are still seeking, and especially with support from the South Africa Center for Evidence. So, and then we have the exchange visit. We have an exchange visit planned for November, and the eBASE team will be traveling with 2 storytellers who have now turned researchers, which is very interesting, and then 3 researchers, which is myself and the 2 storytellers, and then 1 member of government. So we are really looking forward to this. And with this, I want to say thank you for your kind attention.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Okwen, for that very insightful and interesting presentation. I think for me, just to highlight some of the aspects that really stood out for me is this our idea of the stakeholder engagement process. I think is the starting point to see who you can really target. I think that's one a part of the presentation that really stood out for me, and I think maybe during the discussion question session we can explore this more, because I try to imagine how this links to how basically can create demand for these responsive evidence services as well. But I think before we jump into the last presentation, just to encourage our participants to gather up as many questions as possible. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards, after all the presentations themselves. I already see that there are some questions that already have been posted, and we have an opportunity to explore these. So just an encouragement for you to prepare these questions for the discussion section. Without wasting any more time, let me hand over to Zeenat and Mushfika. Over to you.
Thank you, Promise. Just sharing the screen.
100%, no problem.
Hi, thank you all. Following from Laurenz and Patrick, this discussion we will focus on the institutional environment, the Western Cape government in the province of the Western Cape. We will deal with the institutional environment, how we apply REAP in that institutional environment. We will share a partnership initiative with eBASE and also with Cameroon. And we will share an example, just using one responsive evidence method, and some concluding comments, and hopefully it will be interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you. So what is this institutional environment? We are located in the Western Cape in South Africa, the most beautiful tip at the bottom of South Africa. And Western Cape government has to manage or has to deliver services to almost about 7.1 million people. There's about 13 government departments. But I want to focus on our department, the Department of the Premier, because our role it is that we need to enable, we need to guide, and we need to direct. But within that role, we found synergy between what we do in the Provincial Data Office, in the Department of the Premier, and REAP or ACE. And part of those synergies are we realize that we're both shaping evidence services that are integrated. We also realize that we are increasing the reach of responsive evidence methods. From our perspective, from a government perspective, it is about improving government performance. But more so, we were already embarking on coordination of building a community of practice for data governance across Western Cape government and also with external stakeholders. And our aim was to do this and advancing the generation of evidence in the organization, but in collaboration with partners. So our story forward will actually share what are those stakeholders even that we have engaged and the collaboration. So we started this partnership with REAP, and we thought, let us take the community of practice forward. So there's many definitions of community of practices. And this presentation does not zoom into the different definitions. But for us, it was embedding responsive evidence services with stakeholders in the institutional environment, the Western Cape government. So we wanted to respond to the policy. So what are we doing in this partnership? Responding to policy evidence needs with various stakeholders. Patrick spoke about stakeholders, Laurenz did, but using REAP as the platform. So that partnership approach, that streamlines advocacy efforts to sharing of learning and experiences on responsive evidence services. Strengthening the relationship with our evidence users, our producers, and our suppliers, and enhancing the use and the management of that evidence so that we can make better decisions. In bringing together an evidence platform initiative with a community of practice concepts that needed to be grounded for the uptake and use of evidence. And now I'm going to hand over to Mishwika to share with you the REAP and the Community of Practice Partnership Initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeenat. I will take you through the initial steps that we adopted. Firstly, we established a partnership and the initiative. We then executed the initiative, and now we are in a position where we are managing demand. The following slides will go into these 4 steps in a bit more detail. So when we established the partnership and the initiative, we had an existing memorandum of understanding in place with the University of Johannesburg. When we partnered with the Africa Centre for Evidence, we established a concept note, and we looked at the introduction of responsive evidence services and responsive evidence methods. From here, we scoped 2 streams, which I will touch on a bit later, through an integrated delivery plan, and we actively engaged and worked together collectively to agree on what we want to deliver for mutual benefit and uptake. And then within the Provincial Data Office, there were elements of the community of practice as well as the REAP partnership that fell into the daily deliverables and running of the Provincial Data Office. So what were these 2 streams that we decided to focus on? The first was around building data capability within a broader data ecosystem and the introduction of new methods. And the second is around communication and advocating within different policy areas and government departments. So what did this delivery plan look like at the onset? We identified 2 evidence methods, one being evidence mapping, as well as evidence synthesis to focus on for the first year. Complementary data and evidence tools such as how-to guides, as well as literacy around potential training programs to roll out amongst our stakeholders. The second stream that's focusing on communication and advocacy, platforms such as this, where we have an opportunity to share and speak to our stakeholders on our partnerships, Africa Evidence Network, our different forums. We also do a departmental newsletter, we engage with our executive, etc. We also engage with the Provincial Data Forum, which I'll explain a bit later. We also find that it's very important for us to capture and tell our story of along this journey. We package responsive evidence methods products so that we communicate it strategically and target to the correct audience. And also, the crux of our partnership today and our presentation today is to actually work and have touch points with the other partners within the broader REAP initiative. So when we started executing, as mentioned previously, we were very active in terms of building capability. We had co-creation workshops, and we established working groups throughout this process. We were basically the generation of fast early adoption because we had platforms and opportunity to advocate something that was practical. The Provincial Data Forum was the main platform that we used, and this forum comprises of the departmental data champions. We also engaged evaluation technical working group, which comprises monitoring and evaluation champions, as well as other technical committees. We got to a stage where we were able to progress from conceptual presentations when sharing what it is that we are doing to actual live demos. And I will showcase some of the examples later. But what we tried to do from the onset was when we started working with additional departments, we always ensured that the departments were involved from the start and that they take ownership of the products. From an organization point of view, at the time of the partnership, the PDO was ready to partner. So what happened? More platforms, more opportunities to advocate. We were able to demonstrate live demos and something practical that we were doing. And with that, an increase in demand. And what does the demand currently look like? As a start, the evidence maps has now grown from an initial target of 3, touching very simply on policy areas with individual government departments, to now looking at 5 complex policy areas across multiple stakeholders. The evidence synthesis to gain insight into government performance initially only focused on the economic sector, and this demand has now shifted from 1 policy area to 3 policy areas. With the extension of the scope from 1 evidence method to respond to 1 policy evidence, there was a need to create a basket of evidence methods to a policy evidence need. Storytelling, and we are very, very excited to collaborate with eBASE later, where there was a specific request for storytelling to be incorporated into the delivery plan from the executive. And then also looking at peer reviewing theories of change that have been developed across multiple policy areas within the Western Cape government. I'm going to share a quick example on how we developed evidence maps and the complementary materials that we also developed with it. So as a start, a summary on the different evidence products with requests from different departments as well as the policy areas that it touches on. So our very first evidence map, we used the Western Cape Government priority data sources to produce that map, which was really a pilot on our side to understand how the mapping will work or can fit into the Provincial Data Office. We're currently reviewing a second evidence map with the Department of Education, where they wanted to map out education legislation as well as the policy landscape that underpins their work. The third evidence map, which we've just initiated with the Department of Health, is looking at mental health and also touching on some of the impacts of COVID-19 in that space. Then, as mentioned on storytelling, we are looking at urbanization in partnership with the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. The evidence synthesis within the economic space, looking at the growth for job strategy with the Department of Economic Development and Tourism. And last but not least, at this point, very much still in conceptualization, is working on a food security evidence map with the Department of Agriculture, partnering with the Department of the Premier. This is just an example of some infographics that we put together that we found is being very instrumental for us to capture not only what evidence mapping is, but what the journey is and what it will take to actually institutionalize and embed evidence mapping as a service within the Provincial Data Office. Some examples of what the evidence maps look like. In the top left-hand corner, the priority data sources evidence map and the draft education legislation and policy landscape evidence map that we are reviewing for sign-off. I'll hand over to Zeenat to do the conclusion. Thank you.
Some concluding comments or some takeaways. So where to from here after this first phase as Laurenz introduced this session? This partnership with REAP is a catalyst in shaping evidence that are integrated. How are we using evidence for change? And whether that change is government performance, the institutional environment, or more so, how do we change the community and the society? And advancing evidence and evidence organization in collaboration with partnership. And that is so powerful because all partners have that common purpose, that we are in partnership and we are collaborating. Very importantly, the rollout of responsive evidence methods beyond the early adopter departments, as Mashfika had mentioned, to more advocacy platforms. Internally, such as the Provincial Data Forum, and externally, such as this forum or any other forum where we could actually carry through the learnings. And then finally, expanding the communication of responsive evidence methods across the Western Cape government for institutionalization and rollout. Thank you. I hand over to Promise.
Thank you so much, Zeenat and Mushfika, and thank you again to all the presenters. Very exciting, and yeah, I think just looking at the last presentation and thinking through it, I think it really shows practicalities in terms of how the producers of evidence have actually been able to collaborate with the users of evidence within different spheres, and that is quite exciting. I think we still have 15 more minutes for this session, and I think 15 minutes we can dedicate to the questions and answers, and we have quite a bit of questions actually. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix it up to just ensure that all the panelists get a chance to respond to some of these questions. But in my mix-up, what I'm basically going to do is the question that is thrown by two individuals from the audiences, and they're similar. I'll just highlight all of them at once. So I think let me just share one question that is coming from the audience, and I think this is directed to Zeenat and Mushfika, and it's from to Lisa Galada, who says, thank you so much for all the speakers for the insightful session. A question for Zeenat and Mushfika is, given that there are so many government departments in your context, how is the interdepartmental relations influenced your experience in this rapid evidence synthesis pilot? Should I repeat it one more time? Given that there are so many government departments in your context, how has the interdepartmental relations influenced your experience of this rapid evidence synthesis pilot?
Okay, now thank you. So we are located, the provincial office are located in the Department of the Premier. So the role of the Department of the Premier is very much takes a coordinating approach. You could see up front in the slide we spoke about we need to direct, we need to enable, and we also influence, but we do that without taking away the mandate of any department or the role of any accounting officer in a particular department. Our role is more bringing a system together, and within bringing that system together, we are already very strong in embedding data governance across the departments. However, this partnership with REAP brought the other dimension in terms of driving an evidence agenda across our stakeholders. So from our side, in terms of influence and intergovernmental relationships, what's very important from us is our communication to our executive authorities. How we communicate so that we can get the acknowledgement of the relevance of the work that we're doing, and more so the buy-in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zeenat, for that response. I think, still on that, I think maybe possibly I will have a follow-up from my side as well, and just to understand how the experience has been working with these several different departments, engaging them. Did you face any challenges with engaging some of these departments, or so just to get a sense of how the process worked in terms of engaging these departments?
Yeah, there are a number of key stakeholders with a common interest, and the common interest is about wanting to know more about how do we use data better, how do we use evidence better. And we have established a provincial data forum. And we engage with that provincial data forum quite regularly. And we have invited Laurenz already also to that provincial data forum. And that is almost our entry point, because that forum have made a commitment to driving data and evidence for change. So we kind of made a pledge also, and we have a terms of reference and have communicated that pledge to everybody in the Western Cape government. But more so, we want to learn from each other, and we want good quality evidence.
100%. Thank you so much. Thank you. Um, yeah, I think the next set of questions are really directed to um, Patrick. We have here Vivian Walsh, who showed a liking for this slide on the power of power and interest. I think that's the stakeholder engagement slide. And she highlights that this is a great way to contextualize. But she was wondering if this could marginalize people with little power, like vulnerable groups. I'm not so
So
sure if you got that. Yeah.
yes, I got that question. Thank you, and thank you, Vivian, for the question. So, in essence, it actually does the opposite, because once you understand that these people do not have the power, the objective, our objective, and the objective we try to build in the minds of the government officials is to move them towards where they are going to have more power. So our objective is to get everybody to the quadrant where everyone has power and interest. So we actively work to move these people to these areas. So we highlight to the ministers, to the ministers, for example, that okay, this is a picture, and this happens during our policy events. That this is the picture of how your stakeholders are around this work that we are doing. So you can see here that the mayor has little power and little interest in all of this. So we want to move him to where he has more power. For the vulnerable groups, he had an interest in seeing this moving forward, but they do not have the power because they are not represented. So it's for them to move them to the other easy. It's just to bring them on board one of our policy events where they have the opportunity to voice their needs and what they want to see done based on the research findings that we have presented earlier on during the policy events. So I think, on the contrary, this will actually empower the vulnerable groups and remove them out of marginalization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was quite insightful. And I think as a follow up, before I also throw in Lauren's questions, we have Sabina here, who is basically saying, okay, thank you so much for that presentation. And she's also thinking around power and interest. But she was kind of like wondering, in the context where the policymakers are actually not very receptive of evidence, due to different priorities or lack of willpower, what do you think is the solution? And she makes an example of the Indian situation, the Indian context, where there is a report, a latest report that's actually suggested that they were amongst that India was amongst the lowest performing with respect to hunger, but the hunger index, sorry, but the government actually negates this fact. So if the problem is not acknowledged in the first place, how can we expect that there will be an interest in finding solutions? What can be done in such situations? So that's Sabina's question.
Okay, so I think there are two different things. In one option, the ministers may be too busy, but there's so much on their table, and it's difficult for them to prioritize. Uh, the second instance, they could actually accommodate this hunger or this thing which, but they just don't have interest. Now, both of them, depending on what is the reason, has to be treated differently. This is where the policy events you the important, but also in convincing policymakers in a playful way. For example, if hunger is the reason, and hunger is actually a very simple example, we are actually working with the government of Western Cape to also raise more interest in urban migration. That's much more complicated. But something like hunger, it's very simple because the evidence is there. If you look with respect to the SDGs, moving people forward, school feeding programs, so there are many programs that tie people feeding and improving the Human Development Index, for example. So if and you build a story, characters, prioritize hunger and how that's improving tax revenue, this will have to get the attention of the policy. The trick, the information in a non-conventional manner, and then in another all the emotional things that we humans evolve, and an opportunity for us to see things that we have not seen before, thereby we can be able to act on them. So these are the different approaches that we can use. For example, for the government in India, the interest that they should put in hunger. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patrick, for that response. I think the next set of questions are really directed to Laurenz. We have one question from Jonathan Bacon, who's asking around the use of rapid reviews, and basically saying, have the rapid reviews been used? And also indicates that it's impressive that the land reform evidence map was presented to the president. Did it have an impact? That's from Jonathan Bacon.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. And I guess, right, you would probably be a better place to actually answer that question on the land reform map, because you will let that work. But I'm very happy to speak on your behalf, if that's okay with you. It's a great question. So I do think, Jonathan, that we've seen the closer these responsive or rapid reviews are produced, the higher the likelihood of being used for decision making. So I think it's almost the more we can move them to the decision making on the user side, the higher the likelihood. I don't think there ever is there's no guarantee. Like there's oftentimes even work that's requested, and then the politics change a little bit, or the environment changes, and then it might not be the right product at the right time. And I think that's why for REAP, it's really exciting that it's kind of an investment in a basket of methods, because we know that any one product might not be the relevant product if context changes. So the more tools we have at our disposal, the more likely we are to have the right answer to the decision-making need. I think from Mushfiqa's slides, you might have seen that there's certainly something around the rapid synthesis and the maps that decision makers interested in, and it's amazing what I think the PDO has produced in such a short period of time. The amount of maps, it's quite exciting to see, and I think there we can probably make a case, and I hope colleagues agree that this is moving quite close to the use application, and it's being driven from within the decision-making organization. So yeah, I hope that has answered that quickly, and promise feel free if you answered properly on the land reform, which is really your piece of work. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. So I'm just happy that today I'm on the other side, and I think I'm happy to engage Jonathan even more, possibly during this session, during this conference, or afterwards to discuss the details of land reform. But I think it was really quite an exciting project where we responded directly with the evidence base to what was really going to present themselves. But I think the question on impact is a very important one. But as you are aware, there's always these, difficulties, challenges that we're still facing around how do we measure, the impact of evidence use. But we'll hope that in future we have these systems to be able to measure that. I think I've gotten a notification that we've run out of time for this session. But just to say thank you to the audiences who have managed to join this session. And thank you for the discussions. Thank you for the questions. And I really hope that you enjoyed the session. And obviously, thank you to the panelists for those interesting insights and your presentations. To the audience, we might have not managed to, go through all the questions, but feel free to engage the presenters via the conference platform or with other communication, other channels of communications as well. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.